Cool. Well, hi there, Charles.
Hello.
My first question for you is going to be, what were some of the major events in the history of learning that brought you where you were today, whether those be sort of academic events? Yeah, just like a brief history of Charles.
Brief history. Well, when you said that, there are two situations that come to mind. And they were negative prompts, actually.
Yeah, what it's like, but
One prompt is when I was a kid, and I was in a Catholic, after school, learning to go for, I think, first communion, something like that. And so there was all these oral tests that we had to go through. And the nuns were amazed at the way I talked. And so they introduced me to the priests, and the priests then, also amazed, introduced me to the Monsignor. They were all amazed, and they thought I was wonderful because I talked so clearly. And as a little black kid growing up in a predominantly white community, which I did, I didn't realize it until much later on how odd that was, and they probably thought, wow, he can speak for his people. And I was thrilled when that happened, obviously, because I was like 7 or 8 years old. This sense of authority. So I worked with my voice. I mean, not consciously, but I recognized my voice was something that was seen as different, special, etc. And that stayed with me. And then I think when I was in university, a poetry teacher of mine, after I showed him some of my poems, had told me he was a white man. He told me he was going to teach me how to write like a black man. And I was like, excuse me? And he repeated it. So I dropped this course and decided to discover for myself. That really pushed me deeper into reading black artists and artists of other racial backgrounds, Aboriginal artists, queer artists, etc. Just a sort of sense of, I didn't want myself to be defined. I wanted to define myself. I wanted to explore. So those were two. And I think the third one would have been when I went to playwriting workshops in Harlem for about 6 years, off and on. And so I'd walk, because I lived in Spanish Harlem, and I'd walk from 95th Street and 2nd Avenue to 125th Street and 7th Avenue. And these playwriting workshops were mostly in the nighttime. And it was interesting, that exposure twice a week to all these different workshop plays that were coming through, the sense of blackness as plural, not as singular. That there were a variety of stories, there were a variety of ways of telling these stories, whether based on gender, sexual orientation, class, the physical locale in which people grew up in, their skin color. And I said, wow. So those were three something like that, important moments for me in terms of always exploring the particular.
If you hadn't been exposed to the certain art mediums, you would, like if you hadn't had the poetry to go with those institutions, like in other words, if you hadn't found your voice,
Right.
per se, in the tune of poetry, do you think you still would have been able to express yourself over different media? Or do you think poetry sort of found you in that sense? Or?
I'd have loved to have been a musician. However, that didn't happen. My parents weren't, we were not well situated economically. And, my family did not have an appreciation for the arts. And so even being a poet was a bit outside of their desires for me, most of their desires. I really don't know, other than when I write poetry, I listen to a lot of music. And I fashion my poetry in some ways after what's called avant-garde jazz. But if I didn't, I think I'd have preferred, music would have been my passion. It still is, but not as a musician.
Okay. Cool. So what kind of, so talk about jazz, what kind of elements of jazz do you think reflect back on your poetry? Like what kind of composition, what kind of things come into your mind?
Atonality, fragmentation, improvisation, Um, gut, wrenching gut. The rawness of lived experience. I remember once there was a play that I saw, a workshop, when I went to the Frank Silvera's writer's workshop in Harlem. And it was a playwright from Philadelphia. I was pretty young at the time, maybe 23 years old. And in the end of the play, he had this cacophony of voices of all these characters who had in essence gone mad through the process of the drama. And they were just all speaking randomly, and that really scared the life out of me. And I remember commenting, saying, that was too much. It was overbearing. And the man just looked at me and said, I've been hanging out with you for a couple of months here, and I really see that you're getting a really good sense of drama. You now need to match that with our experiences. That to live our lives can bring one to madness. And so when I think about what I want in the poetry, I want to bring about that sense of discomfort, of anxiety, of stress, of anger, of sorrow. Yeah, there are some moments of joy, but I think the collective experience of blackness is not that. So, the form of music that I listen to is I mirror it in writing. So when I write, I rarely use punctuation. I do lots of breaks within the line, which challenges the reader or the listener and me as a reader to think, okay, now how do I want to put the words together? Where do I want to take breaths? Mm-hmm. I can change it depending upon how I feel.
Mm-hmm. And do you think those same formative elements tie into, the content or the meanings of your poetry? Could you talk more about what kind of, are you trying to send a certain message with these poems, trying to tell a certain history?
Yeah, I've got 2 books of my own out, and I've edited I've edited 3 collections. I'm working on now another collection of my own. So in the 2 books that are mine, Partial Lives, and the title itself, I kind of said that, it really reflects the theme that, we can only tell part of the lives. It's so difficult to get beyond all the masks that we wear. And the other one is Travelogue of the Bereaved, and that's coming out this month. Actually, it's got my hands-on copy on Saturday. And just the title itself, Travelogue of the Bereaved. This is documenting this excursion across North America as a moment of grief. And the form is really important to the story. So rather than a linear telling or standard verse, although I will use couplets and triplets and all that kind of stuff, a lot of times, like I say, I break up the language. I will have a line in which there are rather significant breaks. And as I say, rarely do I use punctuation. And it's the impermanence I'm trying to get at. It's the contingency, the unpredictable nature of what it means to live in a hostile world.
Okay. So, when people are experiencing your sort of art or works, what do you think there's something specific that they should get out of it, or do you think there's a certain is there a message there you're trying to convey, like with like a story of grief traveling across the nation, a certain perspective, a certain empathy you're trying to bring out in people? What are some of the messages?
It depends on the pieces I do. So, in each performance or reading, and particularly if it's a performance is different than reading in the sense that I'm working with other artists, which I prefer to do because it's a lot more fun, more engaging. And it gives more of a, like going back to film, as we were talking about earlier, one of the things about film is that we see, we hear words, we see characters, we see background, the colors, all these things that happen subconsciously, subliminally, in his music that rides with the emotions of the words, especially if done well. So in the reading, if I'm reading poems that I think are historical, then the likelihood is there's a sense of anger that I will be reading with, a sense of biting satire, cynicism. If they're poems about my personal life, particularly about growing up and the deaths that have happened in my family, then they're more sorrowful, and more mournful, and more reflective. And the music. So, for example, I have this. Give you two examples. On the family side, I have this poem, performance piece called Cantus, and interesting, it's done to Arvo Par's Cantus of Benjamin Britten. And I have 3 poems that I read in that are poems to trying to understand my father, who died, when I was very young, when I was 4 years old. And there were all these stories about him, and I'm just trying to reconcile, this absence in my life. I put that music together with the poem, read it, record it, send it to a dancer, and say, here's what I feel, body movement. He then creates these characters who play a role that goes with the poem. So when I push that out there, the sense is, and the Arvo Par piece, if you get a chance to listen to it, he's a minimalist. It's very still. It's orchestral. The weight of the violins just really pushes in on you, and it's a 5-minute, half-minute piece. And it really, because the stillness of the music combined with the tragedy that you see in the dancers, combined with the words of a man trying to talk about a young boy who's trying to understand an absent father through stories, so it creates a sense of sorrow, it creates a sense of wonder, grief. Yeah. So that's one. And then with another piece that they call Multiverse, it's like a rocket. It's just pure anger. Yeah. And the poem are shaped like stream of consciousness. They are actually stream of consciousness writing. They're read like a saxophone solo. The music is a saxophone and a piano, and it's really intense. It's about 3-4 minutes long. And the dance is very abstract, and the character in the dance, portrays a badass character. Is the best way I can describe it. So those are the kinds of things that I try to get at, and then I do stuff that's just about beauty. Just the everyday beauty of a day like this, and dance is doing something with kora music and. Yeah, so it really depends on the poem and the piece, but I do want the audience, or the people who are listening, to leave with a feeling. That's why I work with dances and music. Mm-hmm. So it's much more complete than just reading words.
Okay. So complete might be a word to describe what I'm going to ask, but when these performances, like the first time in class that sort of played a song with the poem and the dancing there, I just had I felt like almost overcome by the information coming at me. Like usually we're looking at the monolithic, like the song, and then it's the music video, but the tempo of a poem with dancing that actually is conveying a meaning as opposed to just echoing one. As sort of an audience member, or a lay audience member maybe, how is one to interpret this? Should you let yourself be overwhelmed by the complete experience? Are there certain thought processes? So how do you think a lay audience member seeing, say a Wind in the Leaves piece? What would you tell them if they said, I'm just overcome?
Say good.
Good.
So am I. It is experiential. It really is. It really is one that's more visceral than intellectual. Okay. So part of the creative process for me has moved away from intellectual to body. So for example, when I write, I'll do movement first, Tai Chi or dance moves, something to begin to evoke something through the body. And then I'll sit down and write. And I'll go back and forth. Music is usually on when I'm in the creative process. Mm-hmm. When I'm editing, I no music. I just get down to, okay, get. But you know what? I always love it. So the last performance we did in our group, we were doing this new piece. And it's done to another minimalist who I like a lot, Meredith Monk. And she does a cappella vocalization, actually. Mm-hmm. She doesn't use words. And it's with piano. And the piece is called Biography. And the poems to it are, it comes in a sequence of poems about my family. And so I borrow from some of the earlier poems, but there's one poem in particular that's very new. And it's a poem to one of my older brothers, who I'm very close with. He's about 10 years older than I. And he was the first one to discover that one of our brothers, this is before I was born, had actually drowned. They were in a lake together, and he was swimming, and he turned around, and his younger brother is not there. So it tries to explore what is the feeling of a 10-year-old to turn around and not see your brother there. What is that like? And so the music, which is all vocalese, churns the gut. I remember when we did this, and it was the first time I've ever danced publicly as well. Before we were even done, people were already on their feet. It was a small gathering, 35 people, but it just hit them, and that's what I'm looking for. I don't, people can talk, what does that poem mean? If they are moved viscerally, then they got it. They can buy the book later, which would be nice, and read it, but I don't really talk about the meanings of the poems. I really, they're pretty accessible, I think. But the best way I feel is if somebody comes away feeling it, that's so much better. Okay.
More on these feelings. So I know you've had a lot of experience and involvement in sort of arts, culture, media areas. What are some people or performances that really brought that experience or of meaning or overwhelming to you?
Yeah. Michael Greyeyes, who teaches at York University, runs a company called Signal Theater. And he did, I think, the best dance theater performance I saw last year. Was at the Harborfront. And it was a story about post-traumatic stress in veterans of war. And it was broken into two parts. And the first part were Aboriginal peoples, his background. And I can't remember if he said it was family. It didn't really matter if they were family relations. It was two brothers who came back after the Second World War, and they were suffering from post-traumatic stress. And there was a story in there about whether or not they had actually raped a Filipino woman or something like that. And the second part was very different. It was about Iraq. Mm-hmm. And so the outsiders, the others, were Muslim women. And just the way it was done, the lighting, there was one dance scene of the Aboriginal brothers being back and being celebrated for being back, and all these beer bottles, so almost in a way playing on the stereotype of drunken Indian. At the same time, this post-traumatic stress disorder. I would never want to be in a war. I would never want to come back. I don't know how people sleep if they survive war and they've been in, whatever. And just the way the dance then went between these bottles, balancing, knocking some down, etc. Was powerful. It was very powerful. And then to see him take the same thought process of outsiders and to then look at it in the context of Iraq, it's like, so that was one that moved me really a lot. Another one was a couple of years ago, was a group from Colombia, and I saw this in Kitchener-Waterloo. It was about the choreographer's mother suffering, slipping into dementia. And the dance was incredibly beautiful. They had these 4 dancers, all women, who were in various movements throughout that were very gripping. they had this older character dancer, an older woman, who simply lay in one spot for the whole thing. Then they had a violinist. He came out of the refrigerator and sat on the refrigerator. There was some humor, but there was also this gripping thing. And at one point, I remember, I saw it twice, 2 nights in a row. The first night I saw it, I was too far back. And the second night I got seats right down front because I wanted to see the face. I wanted to see the faces. So one scene in the dance is one of the younger dancers takes plates, puts a cloth on the woman lying down, and then puts another cloth on top of it, and she breaks the plates with a hammer. And at one point, I saw blood coming from the ear of the woman who was lying down. I thought it was part of the act. She didn't move the whole time. So at the end, because one of the dancers I worked with knew them, we were back in the dressing room with them, and there they were, patching up this cut. And I said, wow, that was real. She said, oh yeah, I was not playing. Well, okay. It was just amazing. I mean, all the dance was amazing, but what really got me was that in that moment, she was able to contain that pain and continue on with the dance, and to actually have people believe that was part of the dance, because I did. It was a very, and I remember the scene in the background. They used some graphic visual effects to, lines, and then the lines became blurred, and it was like things melting. It was again a complete performance piece. The violinist playing live music. There was recorded music. There was some words, but these are the words of a demented individual coming out from these young dancers. It was tough. So I mean, those are the things I love to see, because then I leave, and I think I saw it 3 years ago. I remember it very, very, very much, very detailed.
With regard to what you're saying, the popular culture, sort of the trends, like, we want things that are real, that are emotional, and when you're talking about the injury that she sustained, I sort of had a flashback to watching The Wrestler and him faking the blood.
Right.
But in some sense, it was actually his own blood doing it. But you need the performativity, the realness of this. Do you think a lot of people are genuinely drawn towards these real epics of emotion, or do you think more and more we just look for the intellectual sides of things? And do you think there's a right answer, or just that humanity should? Yeah, pretty big weird question.
Yeah, we're all over the map. I mean, I have to go back to my personal preference.
Yeah.
So I prefer the things that are much more emotive, that grip me, that make me struggle for days, that keep me up at night. Sometimes pure entertainment's great. There's no real meaning. There's no intended, comedies or, just things that are. I mean, I love lousy B movies just for mindlessness. But at the same time, when I really want to. And I have to kind of. The arts are all over the map, and that's a good thing on one hand. On the other hand, I also worry that in being all over the map, do we? And this is where I have my debates around funding. Do we fund things that are more popular? And what does that mean? Do we fund things because they are, how do you say it, what's the word I'm looking for? They're clever. Mm-hmm. So for example, I saw a couple of years ago a dance company doing something at the Bada Shoe Museum, which was called, both a dance and acrobatics. And I went because I'd just been on a Canada Council jury, and I was learning about circus arts in Quebec. And I thought, okay, that's something I didn't really know about. Cool. And so I figured, let me see this, whatever. The artist has a rather good reputation. And what I saw were dancers trying to do work on ropes and stuff like that where they were not aerialists. And so it really took away from the performance, because like, wow, you can just see they're not aerialists. And all they're doing, I can do that. It's like, not, but yet this person is rather popular. And I was like, okay, it gets funding, all that kind of thing. Cool, whatever. But it just seems to be the uniqueness of the form, in my view, not necessarily the quality of the work. Because and I wasn't alone. There were a number of people I was with that night. We just kind of said, "Wow, really? Really? Okay." Compared to something I put on my Facebook today, I just found where a couple of dancers in Oakland, California, who strapped, whatever to themselves, and danced vertically on a building. So they were held by very strong ropes, and that same concept was brilliant. Because they danced. They weren't aerialists. But there they were, hanging in the air, vertically. It's like they're on here, vertically dancing, going back and forth. And I'm like, oh, that was amazing. So I'm not, I worry about, and the system of funding of the arts is so, there's never going to be a perfect system. Jury, they tell you now with juries that all juries are subjective. Okay, so that's fine. But it doesn't say anything about the quality of the art that a jury will fund. And one jury, let's say in dance or theater or music or whatever, isn't the same. So maybe there are 3 competitions a year in each of those disciplines. Each of those juries will be different. So each of the results are going to be very different, which is both good and not so good. Because it doesn't really tell you, if you get rejected by all 3, it doesn't tell you the quality of your work. It just simply says, those particular people did not like what you were doing enough to recommend funding. Mm-hmm. You can go the 4th time around, and I've known people who've done this, including myself, and get funded. There's a dance company I know in Vancouver, 6 years they didn't get funded. And they said, get all the dance people off the jury, put theater people on. And they did, and then they got funded. So it really is a bit of a mess at the moment. Bit of a mess, and there's a lot of beauty in the mess too. So I want to say that.
Okay, and what people want from these things. Do you think people's sort of expectations, in some degree, get in the way of them enjoying certain art forms? Like you talked about that, the dancers, they wouldn't give them funding, but the theater people would. Do you think would you call those the sort of expectations or the biases? Like, what do you think those sort of effects are doing to the, arts, culture, media?
Well, they do bring in strong biases. That's the problem. I remember once being on a jury theater, and one of these applicants put down, we do only excellence in theater. And I thought, well, that's a nice mandate. And then I looked at the playlist, and they were all men. And they were all European. And of course I kind of said, well, I guess that's the best in theater. It's all male, all white, all upper class. Okay, not my, So I just kind of said, well, I have some problems with excellence in theater. Is like it leaves out a whole, and I think this is the problem sometimes. So for example, if I send a poem in to a magazine, or if I send a batch of poems into publishers, to a jury, I always struggle with, because I might refer to African mythology, should I put a footnote in? To me, it seems kind of condescending in a poem to put a footnote in. Mm-hmm. However, if I don't, I'm pretty sure that most people on a jury aren't going to know what I'm talking about, and so therefore they're not going to fund it. So either I'm insulting them with a footnote, or I'm putting like, what is he talking about? And this is a problem where sometimes the experiences are, we're all limited in our knowledge. I remember once being at a play in Stratford, was Janet Sears' play Harlem Duet. And the story is about a black couple. I think they're, as I remember, university or, they're upper middle class, professionals. And they run into some conflicts around blackness. And then this turns into a challenge amongst themselves. And, I'm seeing it like, wow, this is interesting, right? Really, it speaks to something I know, understand, I think is important. Go to the washroom in the break, and there's this white guy, and oh, this play really is terrible, and I don't know why it's here at Stratford, and And, you know, and usually I don't say anything to things like this, but it was a long line up in the bathroom, and he just would not shut up. And, you know, stuck on his line. And so finally I turned around and said, you know what? I'm really tired of hearing you talk about what you don't know. You clearly do not understand black experiences in this country or in North America. And so therefore you don't understand the story. And, you know, I could accept that you don't understand the story if you weren't putting it down so much as not being real. Well, let me tell you, the story, from my experience, has a solid grounding in reality. And you might feel more comfortable just owning up to your ignorance, which isn't a problem, it just means you don't know, and talk about what you do know, like the theater design, the stage set, the way the actors are portraying the roles, all these things that, you know, aren't, and just look at whether or not these things are done well. That might help you in appreciating the play, rather than talking about a story that you don't know and judging from your attitude you clearly don't care about. So he shut up. I got to go and take a piss. And, you know, so it's that bothers me, is that how do we come to know the stories that artists want to tell? You know, I remember years ago, you know, well, to go back to that comment about a teacher who was going to teach me how to write like a black man in whose view? His? As a white man? This is how we want to hear you? Or the Catholic school? Wow, listen to his intonation. Listen, my family, you know, my mother had an English background. My father was educated in England. So this is the way we spoke. We didn't. I mean, you know, I can imagine they were only thinking of the stereotypic poor black kid. I didn't talk like that. So I was a model, and that they could get. One of the reasons I went to Harlem is I wanted to learn black English, so I could use it, so I could understand it. And so it can be part of who I am in my life. Yeah. So bringing that forward is, you know, is like it's always a question of who knows the story, who's going to get it.
Who knows the story? Who's going to get it? Okay. So going back to our understanding of history. And who tells stories, you know, where's the power, where's all this stuff. In art, do you value that more than one story is often interpreted or taken from a certain piece of art, more than one story is being told? Like, for instance, if someone goes to, I don't know, a certain performance, or this arrogant white guy will come to the performance and pretend he really enjoyed the sort of presentation of a black history, and he's like, oh yes, I really like this, but he also totally misinterpreted it. He's totally like appropriated in his mind. But I don't know, do you think there's a value comment there to be made? Do you think the authenticity, are you one of these people who really care about the authenticity of a certain history? Or what kind of questions of authenticity come into your own work via these sort of mistaken appropriations? Right. Yeah.
It's funny because I'm struggling with that at the moment. So when I just finished my book on the criminalization of black youth, and in it I use the term black peoples. And so my partner, who's an extremely good editor and very, very knowledgeable and smart, and I run everything through her, comments to me that in her research on the term people and peoples, you know, there's this dictionary definition. And I kind of said, well, you know, that may be the case, but I don't see blackness as a people. I think there are variations based upon local circumstances, upon class, upon skin color, upon, you know, time of arrival in North America. So I went and I too looked in the dictionary, and we had an interesting conversation about the various definitions there are for people and peoples. And in essence, both of us were right. So I chose to go with peoples, but in the front of my book I had to put a bit of an acknowledgement to say, here's why I use this term. Right? So rather than African diasporic or African descent or blacks or black people, I use black peoples to talk about a plurality. And I'm going this weekend to Montreal to speak at McGill University, where I'm talking about black heterogeneity. And I really want to talk about, you know, and one of the interesting things for me living in Canada is I come from New York. Now, while my family's Caribbean, my experience is totally North American, and my formative years were in New York. So my experience is here. We tend to see blackness as, particularly recently, as an immigrant experience. Trinidadian, Jamaican, continental African. Totally forget those came up centuries ago. And I kind of say, well, and for years I struggled with that because I do have a Caribbean background, but it's not something lived in that way. I grew up in the States. And so I struggle with, how do what identity or identities do I claim? And so finally I think, well, fuck it. I come from where I come from. This is the music that influenced. Here's the right. And then, of course, I realize there is, I call it a tributary of folks who came up from the South, who were of African descent, who had very important roles in pushing for equality rights or education, whatever. So that's important to stake that ground and to claim it, without diminishing the role of, let's say, a Marlene or Bessie Phillip, who's Trinidadian, or a Dion Brown, who's Trinidadian, or Christopher Campbell, who's also Bahamian, but he's grown up there, not here. To say, you need to make room for this identity too. And it's interesting because the Haligonians, the Halifax blacks, had for years been very angry at being forgotten because of the immigrant experience from the 70s on up, which totally eclipsed. And the anger is not just at those new blacks, but it's also, there's two types of anger. One is, we've been here since 17-something or another, right? And we were here first as persons of African, well, actually third, but anyway, here a long time. That should not be lost on white folks, because we've contributed to Canadian identity, and it certainly shouldn't be lost on any black folks, period. So there's a bit of a tension. And then you have people like, let's say, George Eliot Clark, who will talk about the need for a black Canadian identity to deal with the African American imperialism, which I can understand through popular culture, and also through the writers and that kind of thing. So there are all these tensions, and that's great. And that's great in some ways because it helps to break apart the essentialist notion that there is something called blackness that is uniform. I said, fine, yes, there are all these ways that we can express ourselves, rather than fight. Let's celebrate that. Let's bring it out. Let's talk about the particularity, the Cornel West piece that I brought in last week. Let's talk about the particularity as opposed to succumbing to some type, because the funders love it. I mean, wow, homogenized blackness? That means they only need to fund one or two black things. Not recognize the diversity of experiences of blackness that we live.
How has the role of a love of learning come into, help you negotiate these sort of different ways of looking at things? Because I think I see in you a sort of, a quest for, you're interested in learning about things, a quest for knowledge, an interest in other people's perspectives, an interest in other people's stories that you might not find in every student these days, especially when it's facilitated by a school system that often wants to present that one viewpoint, at least as long as we have like a sort of a banking school system built on more memorization and stories. Hopefully we're getting away from that. But how do you think, how do you see your own path of learning or your own motivational learning affecting where you are now?
Wow, that's. I think learning is about it's about relationships. The relationship I have with myself, in trying to understand my particular time. Then the relationship I have in a conversation like this, where even your questions prompt me to think about certain things in ways I may not have before, or in ways that actually are a part of what I'm writing for my keynote this weekend. So it's helping me to think through my keynote. Then there are, so it's constant. I mean, it's like I garden. I love gardening, and learning from the transition that's going to begin to happen. Well, it happens every day. Where something comes up, something passes away. then whole seasons will change, and a lot of things will go bare, and snow will come. It's like there's a lot. So it's like it's constant. It's constant. It's constant. It's funny because more particularly, I've been following a Zen Buddhist practice, and so it's I'm learning more about balance, and balance always means that it's like the dialectic. When something happens, something else is going to happen, and rather than get hung up on value of this is good, this is bad, just know it's a process of happening. It's a process of this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen. Till you get to, what I think at the end of the day, what Stuart Hall will call a dialogic, where you live in the meridian, you live in the center, realizing that the nature of things is about opposites. Life and death, male and female, all that kind of stuff. And rather than, sort of saying this is more valuable than that, is appreciate it all, but you then have to be open to it all and take it in. So that's the challenge about that sense of contingency, that sense of awareness. To say this moment is now. What can I, how do I learn from it, from both being engaged in it? So how am I learning from myself while being active? And then what are the circumstances I'm in? Whether I'm sitting at my desk and the dean walks in the door, hey Charles, how are you? The memo's gone around, to having this conversation. It's very different things.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of my favorite learnings, which I read the book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, if you're familiar.
Yep.
And then I watched a lecture by John Vervaeke downtown, U of T, on the cognitive science of wisdom. And the picture in my mind is just so clear. He has the perceptual knowledge, which is sort of a experience, the viscerality of a situation, the feelings of a situation, and then there's what a lot of our learnings focus on today is the procedural, or not the procedural or the perceptual, but the propositional knowledge, like what has to be, what's right or wrong in a certain scenario, like why am I here, and once we take our own experience of the procedural knowledge and we mix that in with a more the propositional plus the procedural leads to perspectival, like finally taking a perspective. And that's what struck me so much about the book, is that basically, Siddhartha is sort of about the Buddha's life, even though it's not really the Buddha, it's just some guy who's living in the time of the Buddha. And, he first goes through the cultural religious path where he learns all about the propositional knowledge. Like, this is what you have to sacrifice here, you have to do this here, but it's not working out for him, so he goes into the woods, he becomes an ascetic, he sits on rose bushes. It's all about the procedural knowledge in that sense. But then he finally begins to forge his own path after meeting the Buddha. He sees all these followers, they're not enlightened, and then he's like, wait, what if I forge my own path in that sense? Then he finally gets to take on his own specific perspective, and that is a new form of knowledge that a lot of people see in, their favorite professor or their favorite, deity or whatever. They finally see someone who has their own perspective, who has the logic behind it, or a certain context. They're contextualized, they know what to put it in, they feel at home in a certain situation.
Right.
So, using these, using these terms, do you see yourself as the Buddha? No, I'm just kidding.
I wish.
Yeah.
No. Well, no. Let me backtrack.
Yeah, let's back.
Intellectually, yes. Procedurally, or in the body, no. And that's the distance between what I understand intellectually about being, and then the effort is, how to find the path or the process that will have me live it. Right? There's a really important line in the Tao Te Ching when Lao Tzu was going to walk off without leaving behind any knowledge. And so one of the guards at the gate said, "You just can't go. We need to understand." And so he wrote the Tao Te Ching. And he always talked about, if you've read it, I gather you have, from some of your thoughts. He talks about the ancients. He said the ancients didn't have to have this written down. They knew it. You know, and this is the thing where I find in nature, squirrels don't question. Do I run from the cat? Do I grab that acorn? Do I jump on this tree? Do I hang from this to grab the bird feed? They just do it. You know, it's a stunning. Flowers don't question. Well, is it now? Is it too cold? Is it, you know, whoa, the sun out today? You know, so there's a sense of being that I long for that would reduce the questions about being, and I would just live. And when I look at, you know, Siddhartha or various other persons who have recognized that, who have lived that, I should say, that's what I get from them. That's what we talk about, full realization. They've come to that point where they are the universe. It's so you know, the language fails here. It just you know, how do you know, like when Yahweh answers Moses and say, "I am that I am." What the hell does that mean? Right? There are moments when I get into a really creative space, and let's say, and I write at night, so most of the time it's that element of stars and moon. I live in a rather cul-de-sac that we don't have a lot of light pollution, so we can actually see the sky very well. And sometimes I look at it and I say, wow, whatever did that, whoa. But then also I recognize, well, whatever did that did me, so part of that. How to fully realize that is and I think part of the creative process is trying to live that, is trying to, but even that's a trap in the end.
Yeah.
Because things come and go. Whatever I create will be gone at some point along the way. It's just as this planet will be gone somewhere along the way. And we won't be able to count the time. And whatever it is that orchestrated all this probably doesn't care about the time. Time is immaterial. It's not important.
Yeah, I really like to. I'm a big fan of humanism and putting these sort of insights, or sort of I don't know, what seem like abstract sort of doing and being and these theoretical talks into trying to find parallels between them and sort of the language of science. In other words, Carl Sagan, the we are star stuff in the face of the universe, finding our own, being a squirrel may seem to a lot of people like a not a very meaningful experience, but if it's all we have at the end of the day.
There's a really good cosmologist, guy named Brian Swim, who teamed up with a Catholic priest, Thomas Merton, and does the story of the universe. And it really tries to, explain it from a sense of divine cosmology. Just this, opening up on how the universe learns. The DNA inherits stuff from previous, so how did the squirrel learn to avoid the cat? How did we learn to avoid the saber-toothed tiger? How do we, how do we learn to harness fire? How does this stuff get passed on generation to generation to generation? And just the constant unfolding, so this whole notion of creativity, which is constant. And so that's the divine power that we experience, is that sense of creativity. It's amazing the way he talks about that match between science and the natural world. And it's interesting now because, you have many scientists who are discovering that Aboriginal healers were right about certain things. Or that, you look at nature, honey can last thousands of years. Honey. And we're killing bees. We can't do that. But they can. I think someone told me they found honey in a Egyptian pyramid buried alongside of some pharaoh. It was 4,000 years old, something like that.
Oh yeah!
Wow! Holy shit! 4,000 years old. So I guess that's the sense of how do we begin to look at science and the inexplicable. No one can talk about time. It's interesting. I don't know if you've seen this movie called Particle Fever.
I don't think so.
Oh, you should see it. It's really great. It's these physicists who are, some of them experimental, some of them are theoretical, and they're really trying to find the Higgs boson, the God particle.
Yeah, yeah.
They've erected this 5-story building full of computers to find what can't be seen. They have scientists from around the world, countries that are at war with each other. Israel and Iran have scientists in the room trying to discover this thing. Mm-hmm. And so the debate focused down between the weight of what it is. They have a sense of when they can find this thing, and I can't remember exactly the scale of measurement, but they say, if it comes out at 115 whatever, then there's a universe. There's a beginning, and then there's an end. If it comes out at 140, then there are many universes. And things are random. So it's a question: is the universe ordered, or is it chaotic, or So and these two guys, it's like watching Big Bang Theory in real life. These guys, young men who are just really smart, and they're able to explain this stuff rather well. Well, the damn thing comes out, and not 115, not 140, it's 125. Mm-hmm. So they don't know. The questions they have are not answered. Or you can say there is a universe because it's closer to 115, or you can say it's a multiverse because it's above 115. Is that 120? And I just think, the Aboriginal story about the trickster. Or go back to Yahweh, I am that I am. This is indefinable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why I think these things are so interesting and so relevant to this conversation is because what we were sort of getting at earlier with the, being overwhelmed, the viscerality of some arts performances and whatnot. I think a lot of people in this sort of austere scientific modern age have almost lost the, I don't know, we call it awe, we call it wonder. Some people want to reclaim the word awe sound.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think these performances that you're a part of and that you've seen over the years really help us, understand what it is to be, or you can use all the catchphrases, humanity fully in line with nature and whatnot. And of course, I'm a huge fan of scientific positivism and the research and the skepticism that goes along with the research in answering these impossible questions. But, yeah, fascinating.
It is. Yep.
Yeah. So I think that's one more question for you.
Yeah.
Another big puncher. So if you had to give a 30-second or so speech to the world, what do you think it would be? Yeah. Or let's go.
Could be that. I'm not good at soundbites.
A 30-second / 5-minute speech to the world.
Wow.
It doesn't have to be related to anything we've talked about.
I was, there's a drummer I love, this guy Sonny Murray, and one time in an interview, all he could say is, wow, wow. And, I thought of that for a long time, and you ever hear him play, he was just feeling it. And he's like, wow. That's all he could say. So I'd say enjoy the wow. Really enjoy the wow. You've seen the film. What's it called? It was a Linklater, one of his early films. It was done to cartoon illustration. Talking something or another. Damn, I can't remember the title. Mm-hmm. It'll come to me later. But in it, there's this one guy talking to another, and he talks about the eternal wow. And it's really about this thing of, just the experience of the moment, because everything is happening now. Just wow. Yeah, so I'd say wow.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's be my 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Wow. Yep.
Wow. Something to reflect on. Cool. Yeah, do you have any other thoughts or comments?
No. Hope that helps you in your research.
Thank you very much.